Kelly Martinez woke up in a metal cell that smelled like rust and fear, and she knew today was the day she would either die or change everything, because the guards had been talking about the arena all week and how no human had ever survived more than 5 minutes against the Xerion warriors. The cell door opened with a grinding sound, and 2 guards stood there with their forearms holding energy weapons, and their faces showed no emotion as they gestured for her to follow them down the long corridor where other humans were kept in cages like animals. She passed by the cells of her crew members who had been captured 3 weeks ago when their ship accidentally entered Xerion space, and their eyes met hers with a mixture of hope and despair because they all knew she was their best fighter, but even that might not be enough. The corridor led to a massive door that opened into blazing sunlight, and the roar of 50,000 alien voices hit her like a physical force as she stepped into the arena, which was bigger than any stadium on Earth, with sand that sparkled purple under the alien sun. Above the arena, on a platform made of crystal, sat Princess Liara of the Xerion Empire, and even from this distance Kelly could see her violet eyes and silver skin that seemed to glow in the light. And the princess was beautiful in a way that was both alien and mesmerizing. The crowd quieted as an announcer spoke in the harsh Xerion language, which Kelly had learned enough of during her captivity to understand that she would face 3 of their champions, and if she survived, she would win her freedom. But no mention was made of her crew. Kelly stretched her muscles and checked the small devices hidden in her boots and belt that she had managed to create from scraps in her cell, because humans were good at making weapons from nothing, and she had been an engineer before becoming a pilot. The first warrior entered from the opposite gate, and he was 12 feet, tall with scales that reflected the light like mirrors and 4 arms that each held a different weapon, and the crowd cheered as he raised them all above his head in a victory pose before the fight even started. Kelly studied his movement and saw that he favored his upper right arm and his left knee seemed slightly stiff, probably from an old injury. And these were the things that human soldiers were trained to notice because they couldn't match aliens in strength, so they had to be smarter. The warrior charged with surprising speed for something so large, and Kelly waited until the last second before diving between his legs and rolling to her feet behind him, where she kicked the back of his weak knee, making him stumble forward into the while Princess Liara leaned forward on her throne because she had never seen anyone move like that against a Xerion warrior. And there was something about the way the human female carried herself with confidence, despite being so small, that made her want to watch more carefully. The warrior spun around with rage in his 6 eyes and swung all 4 weapons at once, but Kelly had already moved, using her smaller size to stay in his blind spots, and every time he turned, she was somewhere else, like smoke that couldn't be caught. The crowd began to mutter because this was not how the fights usually went, where humans cowered and died quickly. But this one danced around their champion, making him look slow and clumsy, and some even began to laugh, which made the warrior even angrier. Kelly pulled a small device from her belt that looked like a simple piece of metal, but when the warrior charged again, she threw it at his face, and it exploded in a flash of light that blinded all 6 of his eyes, making him roar and swing wildly at nothing. She moved in close while he was blind and struck specific points on his body that she had studied from watching the guards and learning where their nerve clusters were located. And after 7 precise hits, the massive warrior fell to his knees, then forward onto the sand. The arena went completely silent for a moment before erupting in shocked voices, because the fight had lasted less than 3 minutes and the human had barely been touched, while their champion lay unconscious on the ground being dragged away by medical staff. The second warrior was already entering, and this one was different, with sleek black armor and devices on his arms that hummed with sonic energy that could shatter bones and rupture organs, and Kelly knew she had to be careful with this one. Princess Liara found herself gripping the arms of her throne as she watched the human female circle the sonic warrior, and there was something graceful about her movements, like she was performing a deadly dance, and Liara had never seen anything quite like it. The sonic warrior fired his weapons, and waves of sound visible as ripples in the air shot toward Kelly, who had already covered her ears with special dampeners. She had made and dove forward under the waves, rolling across the sand toward her opponent. The crowd gasped as Kelly got close enough to touch the warrior and pulled another device from her belt, jamming it into the joint of his armor where it started, smoking and sparking, and the sonic weapons suddenly went silent as their power source failed. Without his primary weapons, the warrior tried to grab Kelly with his hands, but she was already moving, using a fighting style from Earth called Aikido, to redirect his strength against him, and soon he was on the ground with her knee on his neck, until he tapped out in surrender. 2 warriors down, and the crowd was no longer cheering but watching in stunned fascination, as this small human female was doing the impossible, and Princess Liara stood from her throne to get a better view, because something important was happening here. The 3rd warrior entered, and Kelly recognized him as Xerion champion Gorath, who had never lost a fight in the arena, and his natural armor could deflect even military-grade lasers, and his strength was legendary, even among his own people. Kelly reached for her last device, the one she had spent 2 weeks building from parts she had stolen and hidden, and it was a simple rod that extended to about 3 feet long with copper wiring wrapped around it, connected to a power cell she had extracted from the food dispenser. Gorath laughed at her primitive weapon, and the crowd laughed with him, because what could a metal stick do against someone who had survived orbital bombardment? But Kelly just smiled and pressed the activation button, making electricity course through the rod. They circled each other, and Kelly noticed that Princess Liara was now standing at the edge of her platform, watching intently, and their eyes met for just a moment across the distance. And Kelly saw something there that wasn't hatred or contempt, but curiosity. Gorath attacked with measured strikes, testing her defenses, and Kelly dodged and weaved, waiting for her opening, because she would only get one chance against this opponent, and it had to be perfect, or she would die here in this alien sand. Gorath moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost, and his first strike came faster than Kelly expected, but she managed to deflect it with her electric rod, and the spark of contact made him pull back in surprise, because he actually felt that through his armor. Kelly knew she had to end this quickly, because the power cell in her weapon would only last a few minutes, and Gorath was too experienced to fall for simple tricks, so she needed to make him angry enough to make a mistake. She ducked under his swing and struck his side with the rod, sending electricity through his body, and he grunted in pain, which was the first time the crowd had ever heard him make such a sound, and Kelly saw his eyes narrow with rage. Princess Liara watched as the human female fought with intelligence rather than brute force, and she found herself admiring the strategy, because Xerions always relied on their natural advantages, but this human was proving that thinking could beat strength. Gorath grabbed a handful of sand and threw it at Kelly's face, but she had seen that move coming and closed her eyes while rolling to the side, then came up swinging the rod in a wide arc that caught him across the back, making him stumble forward. The crowd was completely silent now, because their greatest champion was being pushed to his limits by a creature they considered inferior, and some began to wonder if everything they believed about humans was wrong. Kelly noticed that Gorath protected his left side more than his right, and she remembered seeing him favoring it slightly when he walked, so she focused her attacks there, hitting the same spot over and over. With the electric rod, Princess Liara found herself holding her breath each time. The human barely dodged Gorath's massive fists, and she didn't understand why she cared what happened to this alien female. But something about her bravery stirred feelings she had never experienced. Gorath finally caught Kelly's rod in his hands, ignoring the electricity flowing through him, and crushed it into pieces with his raw strength. And Kelly jumped back now, weaponless, against the most dangerous warrior in the Xerion Empire. She reached into her boot and pulled out her last resort, which was a small vial of liquid she had extracted from the cleaning chemicals in her cell and mixed together to create something highly corrosive, and she had been saving it for an emergency. When Gorath charged at her with victory in his eyes, Kelly threw the vial at his feet, where it shattered and ate through the sand, creating a hole that his foot fell into, and he pitched forward off balance, giving her the opening she needed. Kelly jumped onto his back and wrapped her arm around his throat in a chokehold that would never work normally, but with him already off balance and struggling to free his foot from the hole, she managed to hold on as he thrashed around, trying to throw her off. The crowd watched in disbelief as their champion fell to his knees with the small human still holding on, and his movements became weaker until finally he collapsed unconscious on the sand, and Kelly stood up, breathing hard, but victorious. Princess Liara stood frozen on her platform, because this was impossible, and yet it had happened, and the human female stood alone in the center of the arena, having defeated 3 of their greatest warriors without killing any of them, which showed mercy that Xerions never offered. The announcer declared Kelly the winner and said she had earned her freedom, But Kelly looked up at Princess Liara and spoke in broken Xerian language, saying she would not leave without the other humans who were imprisoned here, and her voice carried across the silent arena. Liara felt something break inside her chest at those words because this human had just won her life, but was willing to risk it all for others. And that kind of loyalty was something Xerians claimed to value, but rarely showed to anyone outside their own bloodline. The princess raised her hand for silence and spoke to the crowd, saying the human had shown great courage and skill. But her request was unprecedented, and the law said only the victor could go free, not their entire species. Kelly stood straighter and said in clearer Xerian than before that she had learned their language from listening to the guards, and she knew their laws said a victor could challenge any member of the royal family to single combat for a greater prize. The crowd gasped because no one had invoked that ancient law in 500 years, and all eyes turned to Princess Liara, who was the only royal present, and Kelly was looking directly at her with those brown eyes that held no fear. Liara felt her heart racing, because she was one of the best fighters in the Empire, but this human had just proven that skill could overcome strength, and she found herself walking down from her platform without really deciding to do so. The crowd parted as their princess walked across the sand toward the human, and Liara removed her ceremonial robes, revealing the fighting outfit she always wore underneath because a royal must always be ready for combat. Kelly watched the princess approach and noticed how gracefully she moved, like a predator but also like a dancer, and when they stood facing each other, Kelly had to look up to meet her eyes. But she didn't feel small. Princess Liara spoke quietly so only Kelly could hear, saying, "You could have taken your freedom and left, but you choose to risk death for strangers," and Kelly replied that leaving people behind wasn't freedom. It was just another kind of prison. Something passed between them in that moment that neither fully understood, but both felt it like electricity in the air, and Liara said, "Then let us fight, and may the best warrior win." But her voice held something that sounded almost like respect. They began to circle each other, and the crowd held its breath because their princess had never fought a human before, and this human had just done the impossible 3 times, and nobody knew what would happen next. Kelly studied Liara's movements and saw she was perfectly balanced with no obvious weaknesses, and this would be her hardest fight yet. But she also noticed something else in the princess' eyes that looked almost like admiration. Liara attacked first with a speed that surprised Kelly, and her forearms moved in perfect coordination. But Kelly managed to dodge and deflect using techniques from multiple earth martial arts blended together in ways that confused her opponent. They traded strikes and blocks, moving across the sand in what looked more like a dance than a fight, and both were smiling slightly despite the seriousness of the situation because they were both enjoying the challenge. The crowd watched in amazement as their princess struggled to land a solid hit on the human, who seemed to predict her every move, and Kelly was having equal trouble getting past Liara's defenses, which were nearly perfect. After several minutes of intense combat, they locked hands in a test of strength and were pressed close together, breathing hard, and Kelly could see her own reflection in Liara's violet eyes and felt the princess. Trembling slightly, Liara whispered, "Why do you fight so hard for them?" And Kelly whispered back, "Because love makes us strong, and that is what makes us human." And she saw something change in the princess' expression, like understanding dawning. Princess Liara stared into Kelly's eyes for a long moment, and then did something that shocked everyone, including herself, because she released Kelly's hands and stepped back, lowering her arms to her sides in a gesture that meant she was no longer fighting. The entire arena went completely silent as 50,000 beings tried to understand what they were seeing, because their princess had just stopped fighting in the middle of combat, which was considered the highest dishonor in their culture, unless there was a greater purpose. Kelly stood confused with her hands still raised in a defensive position and asked, "What are you doing?" And Liara looked at her with an expression that was completely new on her face, which was something soft and vulnerable and amazed. Liara turned to face the crowd, and her voice rang out clear and strong, saying, "This human has taught me something our empire has forgotten, which is that true strength comes not from conquest, but from protecting those we care about, even at the cost of our own lives." The crowd began to murmur in confusion and anger because this went against everything they believed. But Liara continued, saying she had watched this human risk everything for her people, and that was more courage than she had seen in 1,000 arena battles. Kelly lowered her hands slowly and watched as the princess struggled with words that seemed difficult for her to say, and then Liara turned back to face her and spoke words that would change their worlds forever. I yield to you, human Kelly Martinez, and then louder so everyone could hear, she said, I love you, human. And the arena fell into a silence so complete that the wind across the sand could be heard by everyone present. Kelly stood, frozen, unable to process what had just happened because an alien princess had just declared love for her in front of her entire species, and the words hung in the air like they had physical weight pressing down on everyone. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20, and then someone in the crowd shouted that this was blasphemy, and others joined in. But Liara raised all 4 of her arms and the crowd quieted because she was still their princess. She spoke again, saying that for too long the Xerian Empire had believed that strength meant standing alone. But this human had shown her that connection and sacrifice for others created a strength that no warrior could match with weapons and armor. Kelly finally found her voice and said, Princess, I don't understand. And Liara smiled, which was an expression Kelly had never seen on a Xerian face before, and it transformed her from beautiful to radiant in a way that made Kelly's heart skip. Liara explained that when she watched Kelly fight, she saw someone who drew strength from love for her people, and that was why she could defeat warriors twice her size, because she wasn't fighting for glory or survival, but for something greater. The crowd was growing restless, and some were calling for both of them to be executed for this disgrace. But Liara turned to them and declared that as the challenged party, who had yielded, she was invoking her royal right to grant the victor's request. Every human prisoner would be freed immediately and given safe passage back to Earth, and furthermore, she was declaring that humans were no longer to be considered lesser beings, but equals worthy of respect and alliance. The arena erupted in chaos, with some cheering and others protesting. But the royal decree could not be challenged, and Kelly watched in amazement as guards began moving toward the prison cells to release her crew. Liara walked closer to Kelly and said quietly, There is more I wish to say, but not here. And Kelly nodded, because she could see the princess was taking a massive risk with her position and her life by making these declarations. They left the arena together, with crowds parting before them in shock and confusion, and Kelly could hear the whispers following them about the princess who loved a human, and the human who had changed everything. In the private chambers away from the crowd, Liara finally relaxed, and Kelly saw her trembling and realized how much courage it had taken for her to speak those words in front of everyone. Kelly asked, Why did you say you loved me when we just met? And Liara sat down on a bench that was too tall for Kelly and explained that love for Xerians was different than for humans, because they could sense emotional connections like energy fields. She had felt something from Kelly from the moment she entered the arena, which was a fierce protective love for her crew that blazed like fire, and when they fought, she felt Kelly's compassion, even for her enemies, and it was beautiful in a way she had never experienced. Kelly sat beside her and said, But your people will never accept this. And Liara touched her face gently with one hand, while the other 3 rested at her sides, and said, Then I will teach them, just as you taught me. Over the next days, Kelly and her crew were prepared for departure, but Kelly found herself spending every possible moment with Liara, learning about each other, and discovering that despite their different worlds, they understood each other in ways that surprised them both. Liara learned that Kelly had volunteered for the dangerous mission that brought them here, because she wanted to protect younger crew members, and Kelly learned that Liara had been fighting to reform the Empire from within for years but had felt alone. When the day came for the humans to leave, Liara stood with Kelly at the spaceport, and in front of hundreds of Xerians, she took Kelly's hands in all 4 of hers and said, Come back to me when you have seen your people safe. Kelly promised she would return and asked if Liara would consider visiting Earth, and the princess smiled, saying she would like to see the world that created someone like Kelly and understand how humans found such strength in connection. 3 months later, Kelly stood at the same spaceport, but this time she was waiting for Liara, who had kept her promise to visit Earth after establishing new laws protecting humans and beginning peace negotiations between their species. When Liara emerged from her ship, Kelly ran to her and they embraced, not caring who was watching, because their love had already changed 2 civilizations, and they knew it would continue to bridge the gap between their peoples. They traveled Earth together, with Liara experiencing rain for the first time and crying at the beauty of sunset over the ocean. And she finally understood why humans fought so hard to protect their world and each other. Kelly took her to meet her family, who were hesitant at first, but Liara's genuine curiosity and warmth won them over, and her little niece declared that Liara was the coolest princess ever, which made the alien warrior blush purple. At night they stood on a hill overlooking the city lights, and Liara said she understood now that love wasn't weakness but the greatest power in the universe, because it could make someone face impossible odds and win, not through violence but through courage. Kelly leaned against her and said that was what she had tried to explain in the arena, and Liara wrapped all four arms around her, saying she was grateful for that lesson, because it had freed her from a lifetime of loneliness. They knew there would be challenges ahead, with two civilizations learning to understand each other, but they also knew that love had already done the impossible once, and it would continue to find a way forward. The story of the princess who loved a human spread across the galaxy, inspiring others to look beyond differences and find connection. And Kelly and Liara became symbols of how understanding could overcome fear. They stood together watching the stars, and knowing that the universe had become smaller and larger at the same time, because love had built a bridge between worlds that would never be broken. 6 months had passed since Liara first set foot on Earth, and she had learned to love coffee and thunderstorms and the way Kelly laughed when she was truly happy. But now a message from Zerion had arrived that would test everything they had built together. The message was from the High Council, demanding that Princess Liara return immediately, because rebels were using her absence to claim the throne, and some were saying she had been corrupted by the humans and was no longer fit to rule. Kelly found Liara standing on the balcony of their apartment in Colorado, staring at the mountains, and she could see the weight of two worlds on her shoulders, because Liara had to choose between her duty to her people and her life with Kelly. They both knew this day would come, but that didn't make it easier, and Kelly wrapped her arms around Liara from behind, saying, "Whatever you decide, I will support you, because that is what love means." And Liara leaned back into her warmth. Liara turned in her arms and said, "Come with me to Zerion," because if she had to face the council and the rebels, she wanted Kelly beside her, and maybe together they could show both species that their union was not weakness, but strength. Kelly knew it was dangerous, because many Zerion still hated humans, and she would be walking into a world where she had no allies except Liara. But she also knew that love meant taking risks, and she had never backed down from a challenge. 3 days later, they were aboard Liara's royal ship, heading for Zerion with a small crew of humans and Zerions who had become friends during the cultural exchange program that had started after the arena incident. During the journey, Liara taught Kelly more about Zerion politics and the 5 noble houses that wanted her removed from succession. And Kelly realized that their love had become a symbol that threatened the old ways of thinking. Kelly also learned that Liara had a younger sister named Thyra, who had been sending secret messages of support, saying that many young Zerions were inspired by Liara's courage and wanted change, but were afraid to speak openly. When they arrived at Zerion, the spaceport was surrounded by thousands of beings, with some holding signs of support and others shouting that the princess had betrayed her species by loving a human. Liara held Kelly's hand with 2 of hers, while her other 2 hands remained free for defense, and they walked through the crowd with their heads high, because showing fear would only encourage their enemies. At the palace they were met by Lord Craven, who was Liara's cousin and leader of the strongest opposition, and he looked at Kelly with such disgust that Liara had to hold her back from doing something that would make things worse. Craven said the council would meet tomorrow to decide if Liara was still worthy of her title, and if she lost the vote, she would be exiled and never allowed to return, and Kelly would be imprisoned or executed as an enemy of the state. That night, Kelly and Liara stood in her childhood room, which was filled with weapons and books about military strategy, but also hidden drawings of other worlds and species that showed she had always been curious about the universe beyond. Zeri and Liara showed Kelly a secret passage that led to the old arena, which was smaller than the grand one where they met, and she explained this was where royal children learned to fight, and where she had first dreamed of something more than conquest. They sparred gently in the empty arena, and Kelly asked what would happen if the council voted against them, and Liara said there was another old law that allowed a royal to demand trial by combat for their position. but it meant fighting all challengers. Kelly said, "Then we fight together," and Liara shook her head, saying only she could fight for her title. But Kelly replied that she would fight anyone who tried to separate them, and that was a promise, not a threat. The next morning the council chamber was packed with representatives from all 5 noble houses and hundreds of citizens who had won the lottery to witness this historic meeting, and Kelly stood beside Liara's throne as her chosen companion. Lord Craven spoke first, listing all the ways Liara had broken tradition by falling in love with a human, and suggesting that she had been mentally compromised by some human trick or technology, because no true Zarian could feel that way. Other lords spoke both for and against, with some saying that the alliance with Earth had brought new technology and trade opportunities, while others claimed it would dilute their warrior culture and make them weak. When it was Liara's turn to speak, she stood tall and proud, saying that love had not made her weak but had taught her a strength she never knew existed, and that Kelly had defeated their greatest warriors not through superior force, but through intelligence and courage. She said the Empire could continue to rule through fear and isolation, or it could grow through connection and understanding, and that the choice they made today would determine whether Zarian thrived or slowly died in its own pride. Then something unexpected happened, because Princess Thyra entered the chamber, which she wasn't supposed to do, and announced that she had been conducting polls among the younger generation, and 70% supported Liara's vision of the future. The room erupted in arguments, and Craven demanded that Thyra be removed, but she stood firm, saying the future belonged to the young, and they wanted change and peace and the chance to explore the universe as friends, not conquerors. Kelly watched with pride as the 2 sisters stood together, and more young Zarians in the crowd began to voice their support, and she realized that she and Liara had started something bigger than just their own love story. The council called for order and began the vote, with each house casting their decision, and it was closer than anyone expected, with 2 houses supporting Liara and 2 against, and the final house held the deciding vote. The leader of the 5th house was an ancient Zarian named Elder Morak, who had fought in 100 battles, and everyone expected him to vote against Liara. But he stood slowly and said he had lived long enough to know when change was inevitable. He cast his vote for Liara, saying that any warrior who could inspire such loyalty from another species was exactly the leader Zarian needed, and the chamber exploded with cheers from some and angry shouts from others. Craven stood and declared the vote invalid because Kelly was clearly controlling Liara somehow, and demanded trial by combat to settle the matter properly, and Liara accepted before Kelly could stop her. The trial would be in 3 days, and Liara would face any challenger who questioned her right to rule, and Kelly knew that Craven would make sure she faced the deadliest warriors in the Empire who wanted her dead. The 3 days before the trial passed quickly, and Kelly spent every moment helping Liara prepare, while also working with Thyra to understand the politics behind who would challenge her sister in combat. Thyra revealed that Craven had recruited 7 warriors from different houses, and each one specialized in a different fighting style, which meant Liara would have to adapt constantly without rest between battles. Kelly wanted to protest that this was unfair, but Liara explained that royal trials had no rules except that the royal must face all challengers alone, and if she fell, then Craven would take her place, and Kelly would likely be killed. They trained in the secret arena at night, with Kelly teaching Liara some of the tricks she had used against the Zarian warriors, and Liara was a quick learner who combined human techniques with her own natural abilities. On the morning of the trial, Kelly helped Liara put on her armor, which was lighter than traditional Zarian armor, because she needed speed more than protection, and Kelly kissed her before they left, saying she believed in her. The grand arena was fuller than it had been for Kelly's fight, with every seat taken and crowds watching on screens outside, because this would determine the future direction of their entire civilization. Kelly stood with Thyra on the royal platform that Liara had vacated to enter the arena floor, and she could see the 7 challengers waiting in the shadows, each one looking confident that they would be the one to defeat the princess. Lord Craven announced the rules, which were simple, stating that Liara must defeat all challengers in sequence without leaving the arena, and if she yielded or fell unconscious or died, then she would lose everything. The first challenger was a speed fighter who moved almost too fast to see, but Liara had learned from watching Kelly that speed meant nothing if you could predict where someone would be, and she caught him with a perfectly timed strike. Kelly watched with her heart pounding as Liara immediately faced the second challenger, who used poison blades that would paralyze with even a scratch. But Liara kept her distance and used thrown weapons to disable him from range. The third challenger was a giant even by Zerion standards, and his strength was legendary. But Liara remembered Kelly's advice about using an opponent's strength against them, and she let him tire himself out before striking his pressure points. By the fourth challenger, Liara was breathing hard and had several cuts that were bleeding purple blood. But she didn't slow down because she knew showing weakness would only encourage the remaining fighters. The fourth warrior used technology with electric whips that could strike from 20 feet away. But Liara had learned about electricity from Kelly's weapons, and she used the metal in the arena to ground herself and get close enough to win. Kelly noticed that the crowd was no longer cheering for blood, but watching in tense silence as their princess showed a combination of Zerion strength and human adaptability that they had never seen before. The fifth challenger was female and fought with a style similar to Liara's own, which meant she knew all her moves, but Liara surprised her by suddenly switching to pure human martial arts that Kelly had taught her. When the sixth challenger entered, Kelly recognized him as someone who had spoken against humans in the council, and his hatred made him reckless, and Liara used that emotion against him, making him make mistakes that cost him the fight. The seventh and final challenger was someone nobody expected, because it was Elder Morak's grandson who was considered the best warrior of the younger generation, and he had voted for Liara, but tradition demanded he answer the call. He and Liara circled each other with respect, and he said quietly that he didn't want to do this, but honor demanded it, and Liara replied that she understood and would not hold this against him regardless of the outcome. They fought with incredible skill, and the match lasted longer than all the others combined, with neither able to gain a clear advantage, and Kelly could see that Liara was exhausted and running on pure determination. At one point, they locked arms in close combat, and the grandson whispered that the future was worth fighting for. And then he did something that shocked everyone, because he deliberately left an opening in his defense. Liara saw the opening and hesitated for a split second, understanding what he was doing, but she took it because refusing would dishonor his sacrifice, and she struck him down as gently as she could. The arena was silent as the grandson yielded, and Liara stood, alone, having defeated all 7 challengers, and Kelly could see her swaying on her feet, but still standing proud and undefeated. Lord Craven stood up shouting that the trial was corrupted because the last challenger had thrown the fight. But Elder Morak himself stood and said his grandson had fought with honor and lost with honor, and the result would stand. Craven then did something that broke all traditions, because he jumped into the arena himself, declaring that he would challenge Liara personally, even though the trial was officially over, and the crowd gasped at this breach of law. Liara could barely stand, but she raised her arms to fight, and Kelly couldn't watch this anymore, so she vaulted over the platform railing and landed in the arena, running to stand beside Liara. The crowd roared in outrage and confusion because a human had entered a royal trial, but Kelly announced in perfect Zerion that she was invoking the right of bonding, which allowed a chosen mate to stand with their partner against any threat. Thyra shouted from the platform that the right of bonding was ancient law that superseded trial rules, and even Craven couldn't deny it. Though his face showed pure rage at being outmaneuvered, Kelly and Liara stood side by side facing Craven, and Kelly whispered that they were stronger together, and Liara smiled through her exhaustion, saying that this was what she had been trying to teach her people. Craven charged at them with the fury of someone who saw their worldview crumbling, but Kelly and Liara moved as one person, with Kelly using speed and Liara using strength, and they fought like they had been partners for years. The fight was brutal but short because Craven had expected to face an exhausted Liara alone and not a united pair who covered each other's weaknesses and amplified each other's strengths. When Craven fell defeated, the arena erupted with voices, some cheering and others arguing, but Elder Morak raised his staff for silence and declared that Princess Liara had proven her worth beyond any doubt. He also declared that Kelly Martinez would be recognized as Liara's official bonded mate, with all the rights and protections that position offered, making her the first human to hold royal status in the Zerion Empire. Kelly helped Liara stand tall as they faced the crowd together, and Liara spoke with a voice that carried to every corner, saying that this day marked the beginning of a new era, where strength came from unity, not isolation. The crowd began to chant their names together, and even some who had opposed them seemed moved by what they had witnessed because courage and love had won against tradition and fear.